I remember the exact sound my boots made on the frozen driveway that night, a thin crunch that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet Cleveland air, as if the cold itself was warning me to turn around before I opened the door. It was 1:58 in the morning, a time when most people slept behind warm curtains and pulled blankets, but I had just finished a double shift in the ICU after helping stabilize an elderly patient whose heart had stopped twice. My back ached, my fingers were stiff, and the smell of antiseptic clung to my scrubs like a second skin. I unlocked the front door as quietly as I could, hoping to slip into the house unnoticed, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt the wrongness in the air. The living room was dark except for the dim glow of the hallway light, and that faint glow revealed the silhouette of my father sitting in his old recliner shoulders, squared face, stiff, a half-empty bottle resting against his knee. My stomach dropped so quickly it felt like my organs had shifted. I knew that posture. I knew that silence. Beside him, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and jaw tight, stood my brother Mark. He looked as if he had been pacing for hours, his leg bouncing and eyes darting with an anxious energy that was familiar and dangerous. I tried to keep my voice steady, offering a soft explanation about a patient crashing about staying late, to help the team, about doing the job I had always hoped would make them proud, but my father rose to his feet without a word, his shadow widening across the hardwood floor. He asked why I came home late, why I had not called, why I made them wait like fools. The words were not shouted, but spoken with the heavy disapproval of a man who believed control was the same as love. I said I was sorry, and that I would explain everything, but he stepped closer, and Mark followed his lead like a loyal echo. I could feel my breath shortening even before anything happened, the way the body anticipates a storm before the first drop of rain. When my father's hand struck me, the impact was jarring, not just because of the force, but because of the clarity of the moment, a clarity that felt almost cruel. I stumbled backward into the wooden shelving near the entryway, knocking down a framed picture of the three of us taken when I was 11. My cheek burned, my vision flashed, but I did not cry out. I refused to give him that sound. Mark grabbed my arm as my father stepped forward again, his grip tightening around my wrist, not with hesitation, but with a practiced confidence, as if holding me still was simply another chore he had grown accustomed to performing. My father kept saying I had disrespected him by coming home late, that I had embarrassed the family by working nights, that no daughter in this house would act like she belonged to the world more than she belonged to him. His words came out sharp and controlled, the kind of tone that hides its instability beneath the surface, like a cracked foundation beneath a polished floor. My breath trembled, but I stayed silent. I always stayed silent. Silence had kept me safe for years, or at least kept the worst from getting worse, and on that night I clung to it as tightly as I could. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, matching the rhythm of Mark's tightening grip, every throb reminding me of how easily this family slipped into the roles we had learned long ago. My father as the judge, my brother as the enforcer, me as the one who endured. I knew I could not fight either of them. I knew logic would not work. I knew pleading would only feed the fire. So I waited, breathing through the sting in my chest and the sharp ache blooming beneath my ribs. I waited until their voices softened into a tired anger, until my father finally stepped back, and Mark released my arm with a shove that felt more insulting than painful. My father told me to go to bed and think about the kind of daughter I intended to be. Mark muttered that I should be grateful he held me still, or things would have been worse. They walked away believing they had restored order, believing the night belonged to them. They did not know that something inside me had shifted the moment my back hit that shelving. They did not know that I had reached the end of whatever boundary had kept me tethered to their version of normal. They did not know that silence could be used for more than obedience. As I stood alone in the hallway, steadying myself against the railing of the stairs, I touched the side of my face and felt the warmth beneath the skin, the proof of everything I had always refused to name out loud. I thought about the patient we had fought to save that night in the ICU, the way his chest had risen again after the second shock, how life had returned even after we thought we lost him. I thought about survival and choice and the small sparks of courage that appear when the world narrows into a single unbearable moment. When I finally went upstairs, I moved slowly, not wanting the stairs to creak, not wanting to give away the storm inside my chest. I sat on the edge of my bed, breathing through the pain and the trembling exhaustion, realizing that I could not keep living in this cycle of fear disguised as family. I pressed my hand against my ribs and knew something was wrong. I needed help. I needed truth. I needed to leave. What I did not know was that before the sun rose, I would end up in the ER and that the ER would be only the first stop on the long road toward their destruction. The ride to the hospital felt longer than any shift I had ever worked, even though it was only a 20-minute drive, and every breath I took reminded me that something beneath my ribs was protesting with a quiet, steady ache. My coworker Jenna had insisted on driving me after noticing how slowly I walked through the staff entrance, holding the railing as though gravity had doubled while I changed out of my scrubs. She asked what happened, and I gave the same answer I always did, the one that felt safest in my mouth, a simple explanation about slipping on stairs, which she did not believe but did not challenge. When we reached the ER, the fluorescent lights hit me with a sharp brightness that made everything feel surreal, as if I were watching myself from the edge of the room. Nurses I knew glanced at me with concern, their eyes tracking the bruising that had begun to surface beneath my cheek and along my arm. A triage nurse guided me to a curtained room, speaking gently as she wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm. She asked questions in a soft, practiced tone, the kind used for patients who might break if spoken to too firmly. I could hear the unspoken question beneath every word, but I stayed with the story I had committed to telling her. I fell. Telling her I hit the shelving when I lost balance, telling her I was fine, even as her eyebrows pulled together with disbelief. When the attending physician arrived, he examined my ribs with careful, slow pressure, the kind that both reassures and reveals. He noted a possible fracture, maybe two, and asked again how I fell. His voice held no accusation, only an honest concern that pressed harder against me than any question I wanted to answer. My silence stretched between us until he sighed, ordering an X-ray and CT scan, marking the chart with coded language that often signals something deeper, something unsaid. As they wheeled me toward radiology, I stared at the ceiling tiles passing overhead, each one blurring into the next, and I wondered how long a person could keep a secret before the body itself decided to tell the truth. The imaging confirmed a cracked rib and deeper bruising across my side and shoulder injuries that did not fully match the pattern of a fall. The doctor returned with a printout of the scans, placing them gently beside me. He asked again who hurt me. The room felt colder as I whispered that it was an accident. He did not push, but he studied me with a steady gaze that carried both compassion and a quiet warning, the kind that said he had seen many people say the same thing, and that the truth rarely stayed hidden for long. He handed me a copy of the report, explaining that the hospital records injuries like mine carefully, especially when the explanation does not match the evidence. His voice was calm, professional, but I sensed a subtle shift in the air, as though a door had opened somewhere behind me and I had not yet turned to face it. For a moment, I considered telling him everything, letting the words spill out in the safety of fluorescent lights and medical charts. But my throat tightened with the familiar fear of what would happen if I allowed the story to exist outside my own mind. I folded the papers and tucked them into my bag, feeling the weight of truth pressing against the zipper. After he left, I sat alone in the small exam room, listening to the muffled sounds of monitors beeping down the hall, and I wondered why silence felt safer than honesty, even though honesty was the only thing that could free me. The answer rose quietly. Silence had kept the peace for years, even though that peace came at the cost of my own safety. When Jenna returned to check on me, she offered to call someone to take me home, but I shook my head, insisting I would be fine. She hesitated, torn between respecting my privacy and acting on her instincts, but eventually she nodded, helping me stand slowly. Every step toward the exit reminded me of how fragile my body felt, how each breath carried a gentle throb deep beneath my ribs. The early morning air outside the hospital was colder than when I arrived, sharp enough to make my chest tighten, but I kept walking, determined to reach the curb on my own. I ordered a ride and waited beneath the overhang, holding the medical report in my hand, like a fragile piece of truth I was not yet ready to speak aloud. When the car arrived, I slid carefully into the back seat, watching the city blur past through the window as dawn began to tint the horizon. The closer we drew to my neighborhood, the heavier my chest felt, as if the air itself grew thicker near the house I still called home. When the driver pulled into the driveway, I hesitated before stepping out, feeling the ache in my ribs pulse with each heartbeat. The house looked the same as when I left, quiet and still, but something inside me shifted with a weight I could not ignore. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and walked to the door, knowing that inside waited not only pain, but a question I had avoided for years. As I entered the silent hallway, the chill from outside lingered on my skin colder than any winter wind. I knew then that the night had changed something fundamental, and that returning here would no longer quiet the truth rising inside me. The ER had given me proof of what I had endured. It had recorded the story my voice was not ready to tell. And as I walked upstairs, steadying myself against the railing, I realized that the ER was only the beginning of everything that would come next. The house was still when I stepped inside, the kind of stillness that carries memory more than peace. And as I closed the door behind me, I felt the weight of old habits settling over my shoulders like an invisible coat I had worn since childhood. Silence had been the first language I learned in this home, and long before I understood what survival meant, I had already mastered the art of not speaking. Moving quietly was instinct, not strategy at 12 years old, but by 27 it had become something colder and sharper, a tool I used the way other people used words. As I crept down the hallway toward my room, the ache beneath my ribs pulsed with each step, and I wondered how many times in my life I had walked this same path, bruised inside or out, carrying secrets that felt heavier than my own bones. My father's temper had not always been violent, but it had always been unpredictable. The kind of volatility that trains a child to read shadows on the wall before they read expressions on a face. When I was young, I learned to identify the warning signs long before the storm arrived: the cadence of his footsteps, the sharpness of his voice, the clink of a bottle when he thought no one was listening. Mark learned something different. As the older son, he absorbed our father's anger and turned it outward rather than inward, becoming both weapon and witness, convinced that loyalty meant standing beside the person who caused the most harm. I used to believe we were born into the same story, but Mark grew into a version of survival that required domination, while I became the version that required disappearing. That contrast shaped everything about us. Tonight, as I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, the events replayed in my mind with relentless clarity, each moment sharper than the last. The way my father's eyes narrowed in disappointment when I walked in late, the way Mark stepped forward as if he owned my fear, the way the room seemed to shrink until there was nowhere left for me to stand. And yet, amid the panic and the blows, a strange, cold stillness had taken root inside me, a feeling I had not expected, something that felt almost like calculation. Silence became less about protection and more about control. Not his control, but mine, the quiet refusal to give him the reaction he sought. Growing up, speaking had always made things worse. If I cried, he grew angrier. If I defended myself, he shouted louder. If I blamed him, he blamed me harder. Silence had been the only shield that did not shatter. It taught me how to breathe evenly when I wanted to scream. It taught me how to stay still when my instincts demanded I run. It taught me how to wait out a storm without feeding it. And yet tonight felt like a turning point, the moment where silence shifted from fear to foresight, from helplessness to intention. I reached for the small notebook I had kept hidden for years in the back of my closet, the one lined with dates, phrases, and short entries that recorded moments I never dared to speak aloud. I started keeping it when I was 12 after a teacher noticed a bruise on my forearm and called home. My father's fury that night taught me everything I needed to know about the danger of being believed. So I turned inward instead, writing what I could not say, documenting what no one else saw. At 12, my words filled only half a page, shaky and unsure. At 20, I filled whole sections, desperate to give shape to the pain that had no witness. But I never thought those pages would serve a purpose beyond survival. Tonight, for the first time, I wondered if they might become something more. I flipped through the notebook, scanning entries written at different ages, each one a snapshot of silence. The memory of writing them settled heavy in my chest. The night I missed curfew and my father waited in the yard, the morning Mark shoved me hard enough to bruise, when I refused to lie for him, the summer I worked double shifts to save for nursing school, only to be told I was selfish for wanting a life outside this house. Every entry carried the same absence of sound, the same learned instinct to swallow the truth. Lying in bed now, I realized that silence had not been the weakness I once thought it was. It had been the foundation of something stronger, the discipline that helped me understand the patterns in this house better than either of them understood themselves. Silence had taught me to observe without reacting to analyze, without provoking to plan, without revealing. It had kept me safe long enough to discover that I was no longer as powerless as I once believed. The medical report at my side crinkled as I turned slightly, the reality of tonight resting in its pages. The ER had recorded what I still struggled to say. The images of my ribs, the notation of the bruising, the doctor's quiet concern etched into the chart. All of it formed a truth too solid to dismiss. My body had spoken even when I could not. I felt the shift inside me grow stronger, the clarity that came not from courage, but from exhaustion, from years of enduring what should have never been endured. I was tired of protecting the people who hurt me. I was tired of silence that saved them, but broke me. And yet I did not regret staying quiet tonight. Speaking in that moment would have changed nothing, but silence allowed me to think. It allowed me to survive long enough to see that something had to break, and for the first time, I understood it would not be me. I closed the notebook, gently sliding it back into its hiding place, knowing I would return to it sooner than I ever had before. As dawn crept through the blinds, casting faint lines of light across the room, I realized that silence had served its purpose. It had carried me to this point, but surviving was no longer enough. My father and my brother had spent years believing my silence meant obedience. Tonight, they would learn it meant calculation. Survival was never weakness. Silence was only the first step. Morning light filtered weakly through the blinds when I finally forced myself out of bed, moving slowly as the ache beneath my ribs tugged with every breath, reminding me that the night before had not been a nightmare, but something far more real. The house was unusually quiet, almost pretending to be peaceful, but the walls in this place had memory and silence. Here always felt like a warning rather than a relief. I stepped into the hallway, careful not to make noise, even though I knew both my father and Mark were heavy sleepers after nights like last night. The cold floor sent a shock through my feet, grounding me in the present moment as I tried to keep my mind from drifting back to the blows, the shouting, the way the room had tilted when everything snapped. I pressed my palm against the wall as I walked toward the kitchen, hoping the support would steady my breathing. That was when I saw movement through the window. A small figure bundled in a winter coat clearing frost from her porch. It was Mrs. Whitfield, my 74-year-old neighbor, who had lived next door since before I was born, a woman who still baked pies on Sundays and insisted on watering her flowers even during drought warnings. She paused when she noticed me raising a hand gently before walking toward the fence separating our yards. I hesitated, instinct forcing me to retreat, but something in her expression made me step outside instead. The cold air felt sharper today, almost metallic against the swelling on my cheek. She studied my face with the subtle but painfully perceptive gaze older women seem to possess, the kind that sees more in a second than most people do in a week, and she spoke before I could think of an excuse for my appearance. She told me quietly that she had heard something last night, not loud, just enough to wake her, and she wanted to check on me. I felt my throat tighten, the old instinct rising fast, the one that taught me to deny everything for my own safety. Before I could answer, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small USB drive. Her hand trembled slightly as she offered it to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She explained that after her husband passed, she installed several outdoor security cameras for safety and had forgotten to turn off one that faced our shared fence. She said she checked the footage because she heard noises and that the camera had captured something I needed to see. The world felt briefly suspended as I stared at the tiny device resting in her gloved palm, a single object carrying the weight of everything I had endured. My first instinct was fear not of her, but of what the footage might reveal, because evidence removes the shield of denial, even the denial we use against ourselves. When I finally reached out and took the drive, her fingers brushed mine gently, and she said 4 words that cut through the cold morning air like a soft wind. "Only when you are ready." Something in my chest shifted at that, a fracture not of bone, but of silence. I thanked her quietly, though my voice barely rose above a whisper, and she gave me a small nod before returning to her porch, leaving me with a piece of truth I had never dared to imagine would exist. Inside the house felt different now, as if the walls themselves sensed that something had changed. I walked to my room and closed the door, turning the lock with a soft click that echoed louder inside me than in the hallway. I sat on the edge of my bed, placed the USB in my lap, and stared at it for several seconds before opening my laptop with trembling hands. The folder on the drive contained a single video file labeled by date. My pulse quickened as I clicked it open, bracing myself. The footage began with a grainy image of our porch, the timestamp glowing faintly at the bottom. Snow drifted quietly across the frame, illuminated by the porch light my father always forgot to replace. The camera angle was wide enough to capture the doorway, the shadow of my father's figure, and the moment he reached for me. Even though I knew I had survived that moment watching, it felt like standing outside my own life, seeing the truth from a vantage point I had never been allowed to have. The footage did not show everything, but it showed enough. It showed my father dragging me inside with a force I had never seen from the outside. It showed Mark standing behind him, his posture stiff, his presence unmistakable as he closed the door. It showed the exact moment fear replaced oxygen in my lungs. I paused the video, pressing my hand against my mouth as tears blurred the screen. Not loud tears, just the quiet kind that slip out when truth becomes too heavy to hold. For years, I had carried the burden of not being believed, of knowing that the worst things done to me happened behind walls that seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. Now, with one camera and one neighbor's act of compassion, I had something no one could dismiss. Evidence. Proof. A record of reality stronger than any excuse my father could create. As the tears slowed, I forced myself to re-watch the footage, but this time I did so with intention instead of fear. I noted the timestamps. I noted the angle. I noted the visibility of both my father and Mark. I wrote everything down in my notebook. Then carefully and deliberately, I opened my phone and used its camera to document every bruise on my body. I lifted the hem of my shirt and recorded the swelling that spread across my ribs. I photographed the discoloration along my arm where Mark had gripped me. I took a short video speaking the date and time in a voice steadier than I expected, explaining each injury with calm precision. Every movement hurt, but each photo felt like reclaiming something, like pulling pieces of myself out of the fog of survival and arranging them in the light. I saved all of it in a folder on my phone and labeled the folder simply For Dawn, naming it that felt like a promise to myself, a reminder of the moment everything would turn, the moment silence would end. When I finished documenting everything, I closed my laptop and leaned back on the bed, breathing slowly. The house beyond my door remained eerily quiet, unaware that the walls could no longer contain its secrets. For years, I had survived by denying what was happening. Today, documentation had become the first step towards something my father had never imagined I would have. A way out, a way forward, and a way to speak without ever raising my voice. I barely had time to close my laptop and hide the USB beneath a loose floorboard before I heard the familiar thud of footsteps above me, slow and uneven, the kind that told me my father had finally woken up. Morning sunlight softened the hallway, but inside this house, morning never meant peace. Morning meant awareness. Morning meant resentment. Morning meant consequences for anything he decided counted as disobedience. I held my breath as I listened, still sitting on the edge of the bed, one hand pressing against my ribs, as if I could keep the evidence from showing through my skin. For a moment, I wondered if he would ignore me today, if he would pretend nothing had happened, if the night's violence might get buried under the weight of his hangover. But abusers do not fade. They do not forget. They escalate when they sense even the slightest shift in control. And something in me, though I tried to conceal it, had shifted. I heard my father muttering and the kitchen cabinet slamming as though the hinges offended him. Then came Mark's footsteps, heavier and faster, moving down the hallway until they stopped right in front of my room. The door shook under his fist as he pounded once, twice before yanking the handle aggressively. The lock held. He exhaled sharply, an irritated breath through his teeth, and said in a low, clipped voice that barely restrained his annoyance that I needed to get up and make breakfast because Dad wanted to eat, and Dad did not like to wait. His tone held the same hostility he had shown since we were kids, but this time there was an added sharpness, a defensiveness I had not heard before. It was the sound of someone sensing a threat he could not name. I knew he could not possibly know about the USB or the pictures I had taken, but abusers always feel when something slips from their grasp even before they understand the reason. I unlocked the door slowly and opened it just enough to see the irritation flicker across his face. His eyes scanned my cheek, lingering on the fading discoloration, then shifted to the way I held my ribs, his expression tightening not out of guilt but out of suspicion. He asked what I was hiding. I answered calmly that I was sore and needed to move slowly. He stepped closer, his posture puffed as if he wanted to intimidate me back into the silence he depended on. For years, this tactic worked. Today, though, I kept my expression neutral. Something in my stillness must have unsettled him. Instead of pushing further, he backed away and told me to hurry. My father's voice echoed from the kitchen, calling my name with a tone that told me he wanted obedience, but expected defiance. As I walked down the hallway, each step sending a quiet ache through my ribs, I prepared myself not for confrontation, but for the skill I had perfected over years, the one that kept me safe longer than anything else. Observation. My father sat at the table with his coffee mug in hand, gripping it too tightly, the caffeine doing nothing to sober the stale scent of alcohol clinging to him. His eyes were slightly swollen from sleep, but they carried a sharp, assessing hostility. He looked at me with a narrowed gaze that scanned not my injuries but my attitude. He was searching for signs that I might resist him. Abusers cannot tolerate change. They require sameness, predictability, a script that maintains their power. Something about me unsettled him this morning, even though I said nothing different and moved with the same caution I always had. He watched me gather eggs and bread, and with each glance his suspicion deepened. Mark lingered against the counter, arms crossed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He was restless in a way that felt new, like an animal pacing a cage. Both of them were on edge, and I knew exactly why. Last night, they believed they had torn me back into the place they expected me to stay. Yet this morning, despite the pain in my body, I was not smaller. I was quieter, but not in the way they recognized. Silence had always been their advantage. Now it was mine. As I cracked eggs into the pan, I saw my father lean forward, gripping the edge of the table. He asked why I came home so late the night before. The question was not curiosity. It was accusation wrapped in a demand for submission. My answer needed to be precise. I told him truthfully but carefully that I had stayed late at the hospital because a patient coded and the team needed extra hands. My father scoffed at the explanation, muttering something about how working late was disrespectful and how real families did not tolerate daughters who behaved that way. Mark echoed him with a grunt, nodding as if reinforcing a shared belief. Their resentment hung thick in the air. When breakfast was ready, I placed the plates on the table, moving slowly to avoid aggravating the throbbing in my side. My father studied me as if he were trying to read my thoughts. He asked again more forcefully if there was something I wanted to say. I shook my head and answered that I was tired. And that response, simple as it was, pushed him further out of equilibrium. I could see it clearly. He expected fear. He expected trembling apologies. He expected the version of me who scrambled to make peace whenever he pushed too far. Instead, he found someone calm, someone deliberate, someone he did not quite recognize. His suspicion sharpened into agitation. Abusers sense freedom before the victim embraces it, and nothing terrifies them more. Mark stepped forward, perhaps intending to reassert control, but the sound of a car engine outside made both of them freeze. A vehicle had pulled into the driveway. My father rose slightly from his chair, frowning. Mark looked toward the window. I kept my expression still, but inside something steady anchored itself in my chest. They sensed something shifting. They just did not know how much. They did not know the morning had already begun to turn. They did not know that silence had carried me farther than their fists ever could. They did not know that escalation is the first sign of losing power. And they had no idea that the knock coming next would change everything. The sound of the car engine fading outside settled into the stillness of the kitchen, and for a moment, none of us moved, as if the air itself had taken a breath and was waiting to exhale. My father stared toward the window with a furrowed brow, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table in a way that signaled unease more than anger. Mark stood rigid, shoulders squared, watching for movement beyond the glass, and I could almost see the calculations forming in their minds, both of them sensing something they could not yet name. I kept my gaze low, forcing my expression into the same neutral calm I had practiced for years, because routine meant safety in this house, and any deviation from habit drew suspicion like a magnet. As my father rose from his chair and walked toward the window, I turned back to the stove, pretending to clean the pan even though breakfast was already finished. The quiet clink of utensils against metal steadied my breathing, grounding me in a rhythm they recognized. They expected familiarity. They expected obedience. And I would give them just enough of both to mask the shift happening beneath the surface. My father muttered something about neighborhood cars and mindless drivers before returning to his seat, though his eyes briefly flicked toward me with a scrutiny sharpened by last night's violence. He looked for cracks for signs that anything about me had changed, but routine was the perfect disguise. I moved the way I always did, slow and careful shoulders slightly angled inward as though protecting myself from the world instead of the man a few feet away. Mark grabbed his plate and shoved bacon into his mouth with a distracted frown, but I could sense his restlessness in the way he tapped his fingers against the counter. He had always been perceptive in the worst ways, skilled at detecting shifts in mood, searching for anything he could twist into offense. Today, that instinct made him uneasy. He watched me more than he watched his food, and though I kept my movements deliberate and smooth, I felt the weight of his stare trailing me across the room. My ribs ached with every breath, but I forced my body into its familiar choreography, wiping down the counter, rinsing dishes, stacking them neatly on the rack. Routine was armor. As long as everything looked exactly as it always had, they would not question what I had hidden in my room or the folder labeled for Dawn stored on my phone. When I finally sat across from my father, he cleared his throat in a way that signaled another interrogation, and I braced myself. He asked again why I had been late. I repeated the same explanation with the same soft tone, letting the words fall with practiced precision. He narrowed his eyes, searching for the trembling. He expected the apologetic tone he believed he had trained into me, but instead he found a calm that unsettled him. He asked if I had talked to anyone after leaving the hospital. My pulse quickened beneath the surface of my skin, but I kept my voice steady as I answered no. Silence filled the room, thicker this time, tension curling around the edges of the table. He studied me for several seconds before exhaling sharply, almost disappointed that the moment gave him no opportunity for control. Then he reached for his coffee again, signaling that the routine had worked at least for now. But the air remained charged, as if the house sensed the subtle shift in power. After breakfast, I washed the final pan, letting the warm water soothe the stiffness in my hands, and I listened carefully to the footsteps behind me. I knew the window of predictability would not last forever. He and Mark would not stay still for long. They were waiting for signs of rebellion. I was waiting for the knock on the door that would change everything. As the minutes passed, my father moved to his living room chair, the one he had claimed years ago, as though the fabric held his authority. Mark lingered nearby, pacing occasionally, glancing toward the hallway with suspicion. To them, the morning seemed normal enough, but something in the air felt different, an almost imperceptible change in temperature, a quiet before something larger. I grabbed my jacket from the hook and said softly that I needed to go into work early because of scheduling changes. My father lifted his head sharply, annoyance tightening his jaw, but I met his gaze without flinching. Not defiant, not pleading. Simply factual. His eyes studied my face again, and he hesitated long enough for Mark to shift uncomfortably beside him. Then my father nodded once, dismissive but watchful. Mark muttered something under his breath, but I ignored him, slipping my arms into the sleeves of my coat. As I walked toward the door, every step felt like a negotiation between the life I had endured and the life I was preparing to step into. My ribs hurt. My breath trembled, but beneath the fear, something calmer existed. Something purposeful. I opened the front door slowly, letting the cold morning air hit my face. A grounding sensation that reminded me the world outside this house breathed differently, moved differently, existed differently. The moment the door shut behind me, I exhaled a long, steady breath, the kind that released tension buried so deep it had become part of my posture. The sky was pale blue, streaked with soft clouds, the kind of morning that looked gentle even when life was not. I walked down the small pathway leading to the driveway, pretending not to look at my neighbor's house, even though my awareness sharpened at the thought of the USB hidden beneath my floorboard. The world felt suspended for a brief, fragile moment, as if time itself hesitated before turning the page. Then I heard the faint sound of tires rolling across gravel, slow and deliberate, approaching the very spot where I stood. I did not turn immediately. My breath caught in my chest as I realized it was not just any vehicle. It was a police car, quiet, steady, precise in its arrival. And in that instant, something in me stilled completely. Not fear, not panic, something steadier. Something that knew without fully understanding why that everything I had done this morning was leading exactly to this moment. Routine had been the perfect disguise. Now it was time for the truth to start revealing itself. The police car rolled to a smooth stop at the edge of the driveway, its engine quiet but unmistakably authoritative, and for a moment I simply stood there, my hand frozen on the strap of my bag, as if my body understood before my mind did that this morning was shifting into something irreversible. The cold air brushed against my face, carrying the faint scent of winter leaves and engine exhaust, grounding me in a reality I could no longer outrun. I watched the driver's door open slow and deliberate, and Officer Daniels stepped out. A man I recognized vaguely from community patrol meetings, tall, steady, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively quiet. The passenger door opened next, revealing Officer Ruiz younger, but just as composed, her expression alert, yet calm as she took in the surroundings. They both glanced toward the house behind me, the aging siding, the sagging porch railing, the unspoken tension that seemed to cling to the air like frost. Officer Daniels greeted me by name, his tone gentle but formal, and the moment I heard it, a ripple of panic rose under my skin because officers do not call you by name at your driveway unless something important has already begun. I tried to steady my voice as I answered, asking if everything was all right, though inside I knew that question was pointless. He explained that the hospital flagged my injuries as suspicious and that as required by protocol law enforcement was notified to conduct a wellness check. His words were measured careful, giving me room to breathe while also ensuring I understood the seriousness of the situation. Behind him, Officer Ruiz watched my posture, her eyes scanning the way I held myself slightly guarded, the stiffness in my movements, the marks still faint on my cheek. She took a small step closer, her voice softer as she asked if I was hurt and if I felt safe at home. The questions were simple, but they pressed against a part of me I had spent years barricading. Before I could answer, the front door of the house behind me swung open with a force that made the hinges groan. My father stepped out, jaw-tight, shoulders squared, attempting to project control even though it came off as tension so sharp it cut through the morning air. He demanded to know why police were at his house, his tone abrasive, carrying remnants of last night's chaos. Mark followed behind him, arms crossed, glaring with the same hostility he used whenever he sensed an approaching threat to the family's fragile power structure. Officer Daniels remained calm, stating that they were responding to a medical report and needed to speak with me privately. My father scoffed, waving a dismissive hand as he insisted there was no need for interference, claiming I was clumsy and emotional and that everything was fine in their home. The denial came too quickly, too rehearsed, and both officers picked up on it immediately. They maintained their distance but stood firmly between me and the house, creating a quiet barrier I had never known before. Mark stepped forward, not aggressively, but with enough posturing to make his intent clear, and began telling the officers that I exaggerate things, that I have always been dramatic, that the hospital had misunderstood. His voice held a practiced tone, the same one he used to excuse his own actions when we were younger. Instead of arguing, Officer Ruiz calmly asked him to return to the porch while they spoke with me. That simple request made him bristle, and for a moment his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might refuse, but then he stepped back, though not far, hovering like a guard dog ready to intervene. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath tightening beneath my aching ribs, but the officers noticed and gently guided me a few feet further away enough to create a sense of safety I had not expected to feel. Then came the question that shifted everything. Officer Daniels asked if I had any documentation of my injuries or of the events leading to them. It was the kind of question meant to give me a choice without pressure, a chance to step into truth at my own pace. My throat tightened, but instead of answering outright, I reached for my phone. My hands shook slightly as I unlocked it, opened the 4 Dawn folder, and showed them the first set of images. They looked quietly, carefully, then exchanged a glance that held both concern and confirmation. Without raising their voices or alarming my father, they asked if there was any additional evidence. For a moment, I hesitated, fear and instinct battling inside me, but then I remembered the USB hidden beneath the floorboard, the camera footage that removed all ambiguity. I whispered that there was a video, though I had not told anyone until now. Their posture shifted subtly, becoming more protective. They assured me I could retrieve it safely with their presence. As we walked toward the house, my father's expression changed from irritation to unease, his eyes narrowing as he studied the officer's movements. He demanded again to know what was happening, but this time Officer Ruiz addressed him with firm politeness, stating that I needed privacy to gather belongings for review. The word privacy made his posture stiffen. He took a step forward, but Officer Daniels lifted a hand calmly, not in force, but in boundary. That moment, that single gesture, was the first time in my entire life I had seen someone stand physically between me and my father without fear. When I entered my room with the officers behind me, my breath felt shallow, but my movements were steady as I lifted the floorboard and retrieved the USB. I handed it to them without a word. They did not ask what was on it. They did not need to. They walked back toward the living room, with me, their presence a quiet shield, and when my father demanded to know what I had given them, neither officer answered. Instead, they asked him and Mark to remain seated while they stepped outside to review the contents. The air felt suspended, every molecule tense, as if the house itself was waiting for judgment. For the first time, I was not alone with the truth. For the first time, someone else saw enough to intervene. And for the first time, my father and brother realized something they had never imagined possible. Control was slipping away, not with screaming, not with confrontation, but with a knock that changed everything. The moment the officers stepped outside with the USB, the air inside the house thickened into something I could almost taste, a dense tension pressing against my skin, as if the walls themselves sensed that truth was about to be exposed. My father sat rigidly in his chair, gripping the armrests with white knuckles, his jaw tight enough to crack. Mark paced behind him like a caged animal, his agitation growing with every step. They both watched me as though trying to determine how much I had said, how much I had dared to reveal. But I kept my gaze low and my breathing steady, letting the familiar facade of silence rest over me like a protective cloak. Outside, through the thin fabric of the living room curtain, I could see the faint silhouettes of Officers Daniels and Ruiz standing beside the patrol car. They plugged the USB into a small field device attached to the dashboard, and even from a distance I could sense their shift in posture as they watched the footage. Officer Ruiz placed a hand over her mouth, briefly, not in shock, but in confirmation, while Officer Daniels leaned forward with a stillness that revealed far more than any spoken reaction. They were seeing what I had lived. They were witnessing the moment the narrative I had always been forced to swallow finally found a voice. Mark muttered something sharp under his breath, pacing faster now, glancing between the window and my father with growing panic. My father's breathing deepened, a slow, heavy rhythm that used to signal an outburst, but today it was laced with something unfamiliar. Not anger, not superiority, fear. He rose abruptly and marched toward the window, yanking the curtain aside to glare at the officers as if he could intimidate them from behind glass. When that failed, he turned his gaze on me, and for the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in his eyes, a dark awareness that the story he'd controlled for decades might finally be slipping from his grasp. He asked what I had given them. His voice was quieter than usual, low but sharp, the kind of tone that once froze my blood. Now it only made the air feel colder. I said nothing. Silence had always been my shield, but this time it was also an answer. He stepped closer, towering above me, trying to pull the old fear back into place, but before he reached me, the front door opened and both officers re-entered the house. Their faces calm, their posture firm. The shift in the room was immediate. My father straightened, attempting to regain authority, but Officer Daniels spoke first, requesting that he and Mark sit down. It was not a suggestion. It was a command delivered with measured professionalism. Mark laughed bitterly, trying to mask his unease with defiance, and asked what evidence they thought they had, but Officer Ruiz did not respond to his tone. Instead, she explained that they had reviewed footage showing concerning physical force consistent with potential domestic violence, and that, combined with my injuries and documented medical reports sufficient cause, existed to proceed with a formal intervention. My father barked that they had no right to interfere in family matters. The phrase family matters hung in the air like an accusation against him rather than a justification. Officers Daniels and Ruiz exchanged a glance before calmly stating that when physical harm is involved, the law no longer recognizes silence or private walls as protection for abusers. Mark stepped forward aggressively at that. His shoulders tense, and for an instant the room felt like it might spiral into chaos, but the officers moved between us with practiced precision. Officer Ruiz raised her hand slightly, a nonverbal directive for him to stay back, and though he hesitated, he obeyed an obedience born not of respect, but of the dawning awareness that force would no longer protect him. Then came the moment everything shifted. Officer Daniels turned toward me and asked if I had anywhere safe to go. His tone was gentle, but the weight of the question pressed against my chest. Before I could respond, my father snapped that I was not leaving this house and that outsiders had no right to encourage disobedience under their roof. It was a familiar speech, one that had been used to control me for years, but the officers remained unmoved. Officer Ruiz spoke with a steady clarity that cut through the room. Emily has the right to safety and autonomy, and she is permitted to leave voluntarily. We are here to ensure she does so without interference. The word interference hit my father like a slap. He demanded proof of wrongdoing, insisting that the video did not show everything and that context mattered. His voice climbed with old desperation disguised as authority, but the officers did not engage emotionally. Instead, Officer Daniels explained that obstruction or attempts to prevent a victim from leaving could result in immediate detainment. The threat of legal consequence, not shouted but spoken calmly, made my father freeze. Mark, however, could not accept the shifting power in the room. He pointed at me, accusing me of betrayal, of exaggerating, of trying to ruin the family. His voice shook with a mixture of anger and fear, and he took a step in my direction as if rehearsing old patterns, but both officers moved instantly, forming a barrier between us. Officer Ruiz addressed him directly, stating that approaching me in a threatening manner was not permitted and that continued escalation could lead to charges. His mouth opened as if to argue, but the warning in her voice halted him. For the first time in years, their forward momentum stopped. The officers then asked if I needed help gathering my belongings. The question felt surreal, like a doorway swinging open in a house where every exit had been bricked shut. I nodded, and my father erupted again, ordering the officers not to let me take anything because it was his property. But the officers remained firm. They informed him that I had the right to retrieve personal items and that he was legally prohibited from obstructing the process. His face reddened with silent rage, but he said nothing more when Officer Daniels made direct eye contact with him. As I walked down the hallway toward my room, the officers close behind me, I felt a strange combination of fear and relief rising in my chest, the kind that forms when a person stands at the edge of a cliff and realizes they are finally allowed to step away instead of being pushed. In my room, I gathered essential clothes, my notebook, my phone, and my bag, feeling each item's weight as a reminder of the years I had survived here. When I returned to the living room, my father and brother stayed silent, not out of respect, but because the space between us now belonged to the law, not to them. As I stepped out the front door with the officers beside me, I felt air fill my lungs more fully than it had in years. It was the breath of someone walking toward safety. It was the breath of someone whose silence had finally become evidence. It was the breath of someone no longer trapped. The ride to the shelter was quiet except for the hum of the patrol car's engine and the occasional crackle of the officers' radio's distant voices announcing calls unrelated to my world, yet somehow anchored to the same fragile reality I was now stepping into. I sat in the back seat, not handcuffed, not restrained, but feeling strangely suspended between the life I had always known and the one I was being pulled toward. Officer Ruiz drove while Officer Daniels sat beside her, both speaking softly, their calm presence grounding me in a moment that felt too surreal to fully understand. As the cityscape shifted outside my window, houses giving way to storefronts and then quieter streets, I realized how long it had been since I had looked outward without calculating who might be watching or judging. The shelter appeared unassuming from the outside, a simple brick building with a faded blue awning and a small garden someone had clearly tended with care. It did not look like a place of escape. It looked like a place that held stories, many of them bruised and complicated, woven into the walls by the people who had walked through its doors. When the officers escorted me inside, the warmth of the lobby wrapped around me, a contrast so sharp to the cold house I had left behind that my breath stuttered for a moment. A woman at the front desk, her hair pulled into a loose bun and her eyes soft with understanding, stood to greet me. She introduced herself as Mara and assured me that everything shared here was confidential, that safety was their priority, and that no one could enter without permission from staff. As she spoke, I felt something inside me unclench, just slightly, a tiny release of tension I had not known I was holding. She led me to a small intake room with a table, 2 chairs, and a folder already waiting. She explained that they needed basic information to give me a room and access to services. The words basic information felt strange considering the layers of complexity beneath my silence, but I answered as best I could. When she gently asked what had brought me here, I hesitated, my gaze drifting toward the soft light filtering through the blinds. Instead of recounting every detail, I told her I had left home for my safety. She nodded, not pressing, not demanding stories I was not ready to tell. She simply handed me a pamphlet explaining available resources: therapy, legal aid, medical follow-ups, support groups. Seeing those words on paper made something twist in my chest, an emotion that felt like a blend of grief and possibility. Mara showed me to a small room with a twin bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the garden. It was modest, but to me it felt like a sanctuary. I sat on the bed, letting the mattress dip beneath my weight, and for the first time since last night, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. But peace was fleeting. As soon as I plugged my phone into the wall charger, it vibrated violently, buzzing again and again, until the screen lit with a row of missed calls, texts, and voicemails. My father's number, Mark's number. Unknown numbers I recognized anyway. The messages came in rapid succession, each one hitting me like a quiet tremor beneath the ribs. Come home now. You have ruined everything. Answer the phone. You made us look like monsters. Do you understand what you've done? Then the tone shifted, as threats often do when desperation replaces dominance. If you think you can walk away from family, you are delusional. You will regret this. You want to pretend you are a victim? Go ahead. The last voicemail from Mark was softer in volume but sharper in intent. He whispered that I was ungrateful, that I had embarrassed him, that he knew I would never survive without them. His voice cracked once near the end, not from remorse, but from fear. Abusers fear exposure more than consequences. They fear losing the narrative more than losing control. I forwarded every message to a secure folder, my hands trembling. Mara knocked lightly and peeked into the room, asking if I needed anything. I told her I was fine, but she saw the tension on my face and stepped inside. She offered to connect me with the shelter's legal advocate, someone named Clara, who could explain the next steps, including restraining orders and evidence preservation. Hearing the phrase next steps made the knot in my chest tighten. I had spent so many years measuring survival in days and nights, never in steps toward something new. Clara met with me later that afternoon, a woman in her 40s with a calm voice and a posture that radiated steadiness. She explained the legal process, what qualified as evidence, how courts typically handled domestic cases in Ohio, and what I should avoid doing. Her clarity felt like a lifeline. When she asked if I had documentation, I opened my phone and showed her everything. She studied the photos, the videos, the timestamps. Then she asked if there was anything else, and I slid the USB across the table. The way her expression changed told me she understood completely. She explained that with this level of documentation, I had a strong foundation not just for protection, but for accountability. The word accountability landed heavily echoing in the space between us. After the meeting, I returned to my room exhausted but not broken and lay back on the bed staring at the pattern of the ceiling tiles. It was strange to be in a place where no one yelled, no one demanded obedience, no one monitored my every step. The quiet felt foreign, like something borrowed rather than owned. But as evening settled in, replacing the sharp light of day with a softer glow, I realized that this unfamiliar quiet was the first hint of safety. Still, the threats continued. More texts, more missed calls. My father alternating between rage and feigned concern. Mark insisting I was destroying the family. Each message felt like a reminder of the world I had escaped, a gravitational pull trying to drag me back. But with every ping of my phone, my resolve hardened. Downfall is rarely a dramatic collapse. It begins as a series of shifts, small and quiet, each one gathering momentum until it becomes something unstoppable. And with every threat they sent, they added weight to their own unraveling. Snowballs begin tiny, but once they roll downhill, there is no pulling them back. The morning of the restraining order hearing arrived with a gray sky and a damp chill that seeped through my coat as I stepped off the bus and approached the courthouse, a place that looked both intimidating and oddly hopeful, with its tall columns and glass doors reflecting the overcast light. I had barely slept the night before, my mind looping through every possible scenario, every fear, every version of my father's voice I had carried in my head for decades. Clara met me on the courthouse steps holding a folder tucked beneath her arm and offering a steady smile that grounded me more than she realized. She walked me through security, guiding me toward the small courtroom, reserved for civil protection order cases, its beige walls and muted carpet surprisingly ordinary for a place where so many lives shifted direction. When we entered, I froze at the sight of my father and Mark sitting together at the respondents' table. My father wore a suit I recognized from funerals and holidays, his posture stiff, his expression carefully arranged into concern. Mark sat beside him in a collared shirt. He clearly hated wearing his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward me with a mixture of resentment and disbelief. Seeing them there, dressed in their best attempt at normalcy, almost made me dizzy. They looked like men pleading innocence in a photograph, not like the men who had made survival an everyday task. Clara nudged me gently, reminding me to breathe as we took a seat on the opposite side of the room. The judge entered soon after, a woman with silver streaks in her hair and a calm authority that filled the space before she even spoke. She scanned the docket, adjusted her glasses, and called our case. My father stood first, introducing himself with a polite tone that made my stomach twist, and began describing me as emotional, overwhelmed by work, prone to misunderstanding. Hearing him present himself as a rational, caring parent felt like being submerged underwater, the pressure building behind my ribs until I struggled to stay grounded. Mark chimed in where he could, repeating my father's claims, framing himself as a supportive brother caught in the middle of a fabricated story. The judge listened without expression, her pen moving occasionally across the page. When she finally turned to me, asking if I had evidence to submit, my throat tightened, but I nodded and watched Clara approach the bench with the thick envelope we had prepared. Inside it were printed photographs, screenshots of text messages, copies of my medical report, and a statement from the shelter documenting my arrival. The judge reviewed each page carefully before signaling for Officer Daniels to step forward. I had not known he would testify, and when I saw him enter through the side door, something inside me steadied. He spoke clearly, recounting his observations from the wellness check, noting the injuries visible on my face and arms, the emotional state I was in, and the concerning behavior he had witnessed from my father and brother. When he explained that I had provided additional documentation, including a video, my father's composure cracked. He stood abruptly, denying everything, accusing the officers of misunderstanding, insisting the video was taken out of context. The judge raised her hand, calmly silencing him with a single gesture. She asked to view the footage privately first. The courtroom felt suspended as the clerk set up a monitor and the judge watched the clip in silence. I kept my eyes on the floor, unable to bear seeing it again, but the shift in the room was unmistakable. My father's breathing grew shallow. Mark's knee bounced rapidly. Clara's hand brushed mine in a silent reassurance. When the judge finished, she removed her glasses and folded her hands. Her voice remained calm, but it carried a weight that stopped every sound in the room. She stated that the evidence presented demonstrated a credible threat to my safety. She explained that the combination of medical documentation, officer testimony, and corroborating video created a clear pattern of harm. My father attempted to interrupt, raising his voice with a desperate insistence that I was exaggerating, that I was ungrateful, that family disputes were being twisted into legal drama. The judge did not raise her voice, but her authority cut through his rant. She warned him that further interruptions would result in removal from the courtroom. Mark tried to speak next, claiming I had provoked everything, but the judge reminded him that he was not permitted to address the court without being acknowledged. His jaw snapped shut, and for a moment the room fell completely still. Then the judge turned to me. Her tone softened. She asked if I wished to speak. My heart pounded, but I nodded. I stood slowly, careful of my ribs, and told her that I had lived in fear for a long time, that I had been taught to stay quiet, that the night documented in the video was not the first time I had been harmed. My voice trembled slightly, but I forced myself to finish explaining that leaving had been the first choice I made for my own safety in years. The judge listened without rushing me, offering a small nod when I sat back down. Then she delivered her ruling. She granted the restraining order for a full 5 years, requiring my father and Mark to remain 500 feet away from me at all times. They were prohibited from contacting me by phone, text, email, or through third parties. My father was ordered to surrender any firearms and enroll in anger management. Mark was instructed to complete behavioral counseling. When those words settled over the room, something inside me broke open. Not in pain, but in relief so sharp it almost felt like grief. My father sank into his chair, disbelief etched across his face, while Mark stared at me with betrayal that no longer had power. As the judge adjourned the session, Clara touched my shoulder gently and whispered that I had done something incredibly brave. But bravery was not what I felt. What I felt was the first hint of justice, the quiet power of truth finally speaking louder than blood. Leaving the courthouse felt like stepping into a parallel version of the world, one where the air tasted different, sharper, clearer, touched by something that felt almost like possibility. But possibility is fragile in the first hours after escaping a life built on control. As Clara and I walked down the courthouse steps, she reminded me that restraining orders create boundaries, not guarantees. Consequences take time to settle in, and people who lose power often react before they accept reality. I understood her warning even before my phone began buzzing again. Not with calls this time, but with notifications from the shelter's legal portal and an automated email from the county clerk confirming that the restraining order had been processed and was now enforceable. The words "enforceable protection order" blinked across the screen like a strange reassurance, both comforting and terrifying, a reminder that something irreversible had begun. At the shelter, Mara greeted me with a warm smile, offering soup and a quiet space to breathe. I tried to settle into the afternoon rhythm of the building, listening to the soft sounds of children laughing somewhere down the hall, the gentle closing of doors, the hum of a washing machine. Life continued here in a way I had never seen inside my own home. But any sense of peace evaporated moments later when my phone lit up with a notification from the legal advocate's encrypted line. A violation alert had been triggered. My father had already driven past the shelter. His vehicle had been spotted by the building's security camera creeping along the street, headlights dimmed even though the afternoon was bright. The timestamp was only minutes old. My stomach tightened, though not from fear, in the same way it once had. This was different. This was the moment when consequences stop knocking politely and begin breaking down the illusions abusers cling to. Mara appeared at my doorway again, her expression shifting into something more focused, the practiced calm of someone who had walked many survivors through these exact steps. She assured me the shelter had already contacted law enforcement. I nodded, though part of me felt suspended, caught between the familiar instinct to prepare for retaliation and the newer reality that the law now stood between us. I stepped into the common room just as Officer Ruiz called the shelter's main line to confirm details. Her voice, firm yet steady, filled the space, grounding the rising panic in something structured. She explained that officers were already dispatched to locate my father, and that because he was now under court order, even driving past the shelter constituted a violation that would result in mandatory arrest. Mandatory. The word echoed in my mind, a reminder that this was no longer a private family matter he could control with intimidation or lies. This was legal. This was documented. This was real. A few hours later, as dusk settled over the city and the shelter lights glowed warmly, the call came. My father had been located near a grocery store parking lot 2 blocks away, sitting in his car with the engine running. Officers approached, confirmed his identity, informed him of the violation, and placed him under arrest. The details were shared calmly, factually, without embellishment. But hearing them still made my breath hitch. Not from joy, not from vengeance, but from the weight of understanding what it meant to survive long enough to see accountability begin. Mark, on the other hand, reacted exactly as Clara predicted. The messages he sent were frantic, angry, incoherent. He accused me of setting up my father, of manipulating the system, of destroying their lives for attention. He insisted that everything could still be fixed if I would just talk, just listen, just stop acting like I was the victim of anything real. His desperation poured through every sentence, revealing the unraveling beneath his anger. Abusers often collapse inward before they collapse outward. Yet even as the messages piled up, I felt something inside me settle, a clarity that had not existed before. Every threat, every guilt-laced accusation, every frantic attempt to rewrite history became evidence added to the growing file, each one a piece of their downfall they authored themselves. Exhaustion hit me then, not the kind that sleep could fix, but the deep aching kind that settles into the bones after years of bracing for impact. I returned to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet wash over me. For so long, silence in my life had been dangerous, the prelude to something worse. Now it felt like oxygen. Still, the unraveling continued. The next morning, Clara arrived at the shelter with news. My father had been denied immediate release. The judge reviewing the violation had deemed him a continued risk due to his proximity to the shelter and his refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing. Hearing that shook something loose inside me, a part of my mind that still believed he was untouchable, invincible, above consequences simply because he had always been. But the system had seen what he tried so hard to hide, and now the system was responding. Mark's situation escalated as well. Officers visited the house to deliver formal notice of the restraining order's conditions, and according to the report Clara received, he became verbally aggressive, refusing to cooperate, insisting I was lying. That behavior alone triggered a secondary flag for harassment. His calls to me, which continued through the night despite my lack of response, were automatically logged by the advocate's system. Evidence snowballs. Violations snowball. And downfalls, once they begin, rarely stop halfway down the hill. By the afternoon, as sunlight softened across the shelter's small garden, the weight of the last few days finally cracked something open inside me. I stood at the window, watching the branches sway gently, and realized I was no longer waiting for permission to exist without fear. The world outside did not look different. But I did. My phone buzzed one last time, a message from an unknown number. I opened it instinctively, expecting another attack, but instead I found a single sentence from a distant cousin I barely knew. "I heard what happened. I believe you." Those 5 words landed deeper than any threat, any accusation, any attempt to pull me back. Consequences had begun breaking through their walls, but something else had begun breaking through mine. Safety is not a single moment. Neither is justice. They come in waves, small at first, then larger until the pattern becomes unmistakable. And now, I could feel the tide turning. Returning to the ER felt almost unreal, as if I were stepping into a memory rather than a building I had walked through hundreds of times before. The automatic doors slid open with their familiar whoosh, releasing a wave of antiseptic scent and the low hum of monitors' voices and movement that had been a soundtrack to my working life long before everything at home unraveled. But this time, as I stepped inside, something in the air felt different, almost as if the hospital itself recognized the shift in who I was. I clutched my bag a little tighter, steadying my breathing as I crossed the lobby and made my way toward the staff entrance. My ribs still ached, though the bruising had begun to fade, a physical reminder of a night that had become a catalyst rather than a cage. The receptionist at the front desk glanced up at me with a look of quiet recognition, offering a kind smile that seemed to say she knew I wasn't just returning to work, but returning to myself. I flashed my badge, the same worn plastic card I had carried for years, and walked down the hall with a mix of anticipation and something that hovered between fear and relief. When I reached the break room, the door swung open and familiar voices spilled out, but the moment I stepped inside, the noise softened. Conversations paused. Eyes shifted in my direction. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with something gentler. Jenna was the first to approach her face, etched with concern she tried to mask. She wrapped her arms around me carefully, mindful of my injuries, and whispered that she was glad I was safe. Safe. The word landed differently now, heavier and lighter all at once. I told her I was ready to work again, even if part of me still trembled at the thought of returning to the place where everything started unraveling. She squeezed my hand and said that survivors make some of the best caregivers, a sentiment that warmed something inside me, even as it nudged a quiet ache. As we walked to the nurses' station together, I felt the rhythm of the ER pulse through the floor beneath my feet, steady and insistent. A trauma alert sounded in the distance, and the familiar rush of movement brought a strange clarity. I belonged in this environment of urgency, precision, and purpose. I always had, but today, for the first time, I was here not just as someone who stabilized others, but as someone learning to stabilize herself. Halfway through my shift, an elderly woman came in with chest pain, frightened and alone. I held her hand as she waited for test results, guiding her breathing, reassuring her softly. She stared at me with eyes that glistened with fear, and at one point she whispered that I had a calming presence. That comment tugged unexpectedly at my chest, reminding me of everything I had endured to learn how to be calm in chaos. Later, after escorting her to imaging, I stood for a moment in the dim hallway, leaning lightly against the wall as the weight of the past few days washed over me. I looked down at my hands, steady and capable, the same hands that had cleaned wounds, held frightened patients' compressed chests during codes, and documented the injuries on my own body. The contrast was jarring and liberating at once. When I returned to the nurses' station, my supervisor called me into her office. She closed the door slowly, offering a seat and a cup of warm tea before she spoke. She had been informed about the restraining order, the shelter, and the ongoing legal process. Her voice carried a mixture of professionalism and empathy as she told me that the hospital supported me wholeheartedly, that I had medical leave available if needed, and that safety protocols were already being updated to ensure no one on the restricted list could enter the building without triggering security. She asked how I was coping. I told her the truth, or at least part of it. I said it felt strange, learning to breathe again, like reclaiming oxygen after years of living in thin air. She nodded knowingly, saying that trauma creates patterns the body remembers even when the mind tries to move forward. Before I left her office, she placed a hand on mine and said something that stayed with me long after the shift ended. "You are allowed to heal at your own pace." Healing. The word felt distant but possible. When my shift finally ended, I walked through the quiet hospital corridor, the lights dimmed for the night staff, the walls echoing faintly with the soft footsteps of passing nurses. As I stepped outside into the crisp evening air, I realized how much had changed since the last time I left this building. Last time, I returned to a house filled with fear. Tonight, I returned to a shelter filled with safety. Last time, my injuries were hidden behind silence. Tonight, they were documented truths. Last time I believed pain was something to endure alone. Tonight, I knew that healing could be shared. I paused near the entrance, watching an ambulance pull up its lights, flashing quietly without sirens, carrying someone else's emergency into the building I had just walked out of. And in that moment, I recognized that the ER had not just been the place where my story fractured. It had also become the place where my story began to make sense. It was the first place that saw what I could not yet say. It was the first place that gave my suffering a name. It was the first place that placed truth into the hands of people who knew what to do with it. Returning here did not complete a circle. It started a new one where I could breathe without bracing, one where I could work without hiding, one where my silence no longer protected the wrong people. I walked toward the bus stop feeling lighter than I had in years, each step carrying the quiet, steady truth that healing is not a single moment, but a series of them. And tonight, walking away from the place that had once held my fear, I realized it was now holding something else entirely, the beginning of my freedom. Moving into my own apartment felt less like crossing a threshold and more like stepping into a version of myself I had only ever imagined from a distance. A self who existed in quiet moments between chaos, a self who had never been allowed to take up space without apology. The shelter helped me secure a transitional housing voucher, something I had never known existed, and with Clara's guidance, I found a small one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a weathered brick building overlooking a narrow street lined with maple trees. The apartment was modest, but when I unlocked the door for the first time, the soft click of the deadbolt sliding open echoed through me like a new kind of heartbeat. The space smelled faintly of paint and sunlight, a scent that carried no memory of fear, no echo of shouting, no weight of expectation. It was mine, completely mine. I stood in the empty living room for several minutes, letting the quiet sink into my bones. Freedom, I learned, has a sound, and that sound is silence without tension. After years of measuring peace by the volume of footsteps outside my bedroom door, the absence of noise felt almost disorienting. I paced slowly through the apartment, taking in the details one by one. A small kitchen with chipped counters but clean cabinets. A bathroom with peeling tile, but a mirror that reflected a face I was learning to recognize again. A bedroom big enough for the twin bed donated by the shelter. A window overlooking the street where people walked dogs, carried groceries, lived their lives without fear of sudden rage erupting behind them. That first night, I slept lightly but safely, my body still conditioned to brace at shadows and unexpected sounds. At dawn, I woke to the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic chirping of birds, sounds so ordinary they felt extraordinary after the life I had lived. I brewed coffee in a second-hand coffee maker and sat at the small round table I had purchased from a thrift shop, a table chosen deliberately because of its shape. No sharp edges, no sides that declared hierarchy, just a circle. Equality made of wood. Each morning afterward, I added something new to the apartment. A thrifted lamp, a photo of me with coworkers, a soft blanket. Slowly, the space shifted from empty to lived in each object, a quiet declaration that I was building a life worth protecting. But rebuilding was not only physical, it was internal and emotional excavation that required patience I was still learning to give myself. The shelter connected me with a therapist named Dana, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a voice that never rushed. In her office, surrounded by books and soft lighting, I spoke truths I had never allowed myself to form into words. She taught me how trauma embeds itself in the nervous system, creating patterns that feel like instinct, even when they are survival mechanisms learned in childhood. She reminded me that healing is not linear, that setbacks do not erase progress, that strength is not measured by how quickly one recovers, but by how willing one is to show up for the work. Some sessions left me feeling lighter, as if pieces of myself were finally settling into place. Others left me emotionally raw, confronting memories I had spent a lifetime burying. But I kept going not because I wanted to revisit the past, but because I wanted to understand the future I was building. At work, things shifted too. I started taking on more responsibilities, gradually moving closer to applying for my RN license. My supervisor encouraged me, praising the focus and empathy I brought to each shift. Patients often commented on my calm presence, unaware of the storm that had shaped that calm. One evening, after helping a young man navigate a panic attack, I walked into the supply room and realized I no longer felt like I was pretending to be strong. I was becoming strong. Not because I never faltered, but because I kept rising. The support around me grew in unexpected ways. My elderly neighbor from the shelter era, Mrs. Whitfield, visited my new apartment after Clara told her where I had moved. She brought homemade cookies and a USB backup of the footage, insisting I keep it in a safe place. Her presence felt like a thread connecting my past to my present, woven gently without pressure. She told me she was proud of me, and the words lodged deep in my chest, healing a place I had not realized was wounded. Not everyone understood, of course. A few distant relatives sent mixed messages torn between denial and discomfort. But for the first time, their opinions felt like background noise, irrelevant to the life I was choosing. Every day, I learned something new about myself in the quiet. I learned that I liked the sound of rain on my own windows. I learned that I preferred soft lighting in the evenings. I learned that I did not have to flinch when someone knocked on my door. I learned that laughter, real laughter, felt almost unfamiliar at first, but returned slowly like a song I used to know. And I learned that freedom is not loud or dramatic. It does not announce itself. It settles in, gradually filling the spaces where fear once lived. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed across my round table, I realized something profound. The life I was building did not exist to spite my father or brother. It existed because I finally understood I deserved more than survival. I deserved peace. I deserved softness. I deserved to breathe without counting seconds. And as I sipped my coffee, listening to the quiet hum of my apartment, I felt something I had never felt before. A future. Not imagined, not hoped for, hoped, but real, and quiet, and mine. The courthouse felt colder than the winter morning outside, a chill that seeped into my bones as I walked through the glass doors with Clara at my side. It was the day of sentencing, the day the system would decide whether my father's actions finally carried the weight they always should have. Snow clung to the edges of my coat, melting slowly as we moved through the security line. My palms were damp, my throat tight, but my steps were steady. I had walked into rooms filled with violence before. This room, for once, was built to protect me, not punish me. Still facing the man who had shaped my life with fear, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, even if the ground beneath me was finally solid. We reached the assigned courtroom on the third floor, a space that smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant. Through the narrow rectangular window in the door, I saw him already seated at the defense table. Henry Carter, my father. His posture rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes shadowed. Not by alcohol this time, but by consequence. He wore a pressed shirt as if fabric could erase history. Mark sat behind him, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his arrogance replaced by something resembling uncertainty. I took a slow breath and entered with Clara. The bailiff nodded to me with recognition, his expression softened by something like empathy. This was the same bailiff who had been present during the restraining order hearing. He guided me to the victim's seating area, where I sat clutching my folder of documents, even though I knew everything had already been submitted. Holding it felt symbolic, a reminder that the truth had been gathered piece by piece, photo by photo, report by report, until it could no longer be ignored. My father did not look at me immediately. When he finally did, it was quick, almost startled, as if he expected the version of me he could intimidate, not the one who had survived him. His gaze flickered, darkened, then returned to the judge's bench as if avoiding me could change what was coming. Judge Rowland entered moments later, a man known for being both fair and firm in domestic violence cases. When he sat, the room settled into a tense quiet. The clerk read the charges again, each one hitting the air like a stone dropped into water. Domestic violence. violation of a protective order, harassment, attempted intimidation of a witness, trespassing on healthcare property. Each charge carried a separate weight, a separate story, a separate moment where he had chosen violence over humanity. His public defender rose, attempting to soften the narrative with familiar excuses. He framed my father as a man struggling with stress, alcohol, unemployment, and emotional instability. He called him a family man with flaws. The words washed over me like cold water. Family man, flaws. How easily some people dressed cruelty in softer clothing. Judge Rowland listened without expression, his pen tapping rhythmically against the desk. When the defender finished, the courtroom shifted, all eyes turning toward me. Ms. Carter, would you like to make a victim impact statement? My hands trembled slightly, but when I stood, a quiet resolve filled the shaking spaces. Clara touched my elbow, a grounding gesture, then let go. My voice emerged steadier than I expected. I spoke not about the blows, but about the years of walking on fractured ground. I spoke about silence, how it had been weapon and shield, how it had shaped my childhood, my adulthood, my breath. I spoke about the night that led to the ER, the impact that changed everything, the terror of seeing both him and Mark in the doorway closing off all exits. I described the fear that followed me to the shelter, the apartment, the workplace, the nightly anxiety of wondering whether he would find me again. I told the court how it felt to rebuild myself from a place where nothing had existed but survival. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I let truth do the work. When I finished, a silence fell over the room so complete it felt like the building itself was listening. My father's eyes burned into me not with remorse, but with a wounded pride that had always mistaken control for love. He stood when asked if he had anything to say. His statement was short-clipped and drenched in denial. He accused me of exaggerating, of betraying my family, of letting outsiders twist what he claimed were disciplinary moments. The judge cut him off before he could continue. Enough. The single word echoed like a gavel before the actual one fell. Judge Rowland straightened his papers, adjusting his glasses as he prepared to deliver the sentence. His voice was calm but unwavering. The evidence presented over the course of these proceedings shows a clear, consistent pattern of violence, intimidation, and disregard for the law. Mr. Carter, your actions escalated even after legal boundaries were put in place, demonstrating a willful refusal to comply with court orders designed to protect your daughter. You have shown no remorse. Therefore, the court imposes a sentence of 2 to 4 years in state custody. My father's jaw dropped slightly. The tightness in his shoulders faltered, replaced by shock that flickered across his features like a failing light bulb. The judge continued. Mandatory enrollment in a certified anger management program. Loss of firearm privileges. No contact with Emily Carter for the duration of the sentence and for 5 years following release. 3 deputies moved toward him. Mark blinked rapidly, leaning forward as if unsure whether to intervene or collapse. My father finally looked at me. Not with the rage I expected, but with something deeper, darker, a disbelief that his world was no longer one where he held the leash. His voice cracked as he spoke. You ruined me. The words came out hoarse, almost broken. I met his stare with the calmest truth I had ever spoken. No, you ruined yourself. The bailiff cuffed him gently but firmly. When he turned away from me, the weight of that moment settled into my chest like a closing chapter. As he was escorted out, his voice finally went silent, swallowed by the thick courthouse air and the sound of the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind him. For the first time, the silence did not belong to him. It belonged to me, and it was powerful. The morning light in my apartment, a full year after everything unfolded, looked different from any morning I had ever known. It did not creep in cautiously the way it once had when dawn signaled danger or unpredictability. It entered boldly, unapologetically, washing over the round wooden table I had purchased with my first paycheck after moving out, illuminating the soft grain in the wood like a quiet proclamation of how far I had come. I stood barefoot on the cool kitchen floor, whisking eggs in a ceramic bowl, the sound steady and rhythmic. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted upward from the pot, mingling with the smell of butter warming in the skillet. It was the same breakfast I had made the morning the police arrived, the same ingredients, the same motions, but the meaning had shifted entirely. That day, I had cooked through bruises and fear, using routine as camouflage to survive. Today, I cooked from a place of peace, a place of ownership, a place of self. Clara arrived first, knocking twice before opening the door the way she always did. She carried a small plant with bright green leaves, saying she thought the apartment needed more life. Mrs. Whitfield followed a few minutes later, leaning on her cane and holding a small folder filled with printed photos she insisted I keep as backup of the evidence, though we both knew the legal battle was over. 2 co-workers from the hospital trickled in last, bringing pastries from the bakery downstairs, laughing softly as they removed their coats. As the space filled with warmth, movement, and voices belonging to people who had chosen to stand beside me, my chest tightened with a type of emotion that was neither fear nor grief. It was gratitude. Deep, grounding gratitude. We sat together around the round table, knees bumping gently beneath the surface mugs clinking softly on the wood. The sunlight touched each of them differently, making the room glow with something that felt like quiet celebration. For a moment, no one spoke. We simply existed in the safety of shared company. Then Clara nudged me lightly with her elbow. "You look different this morning," she said with a smile. I answered, "I feel different." They waited, sensing there was more. I rested my fingertips on the table, tracing its smooth surface. The last time I made this breakfast, I trembled through every step. Today, I made it for freedom. The words hung in the air like a soft bell. No dramatic weight, no trembling. Just truth. Mrs. Whitfield dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Clara lifted her mug. To freedom. To peace, one coworker added. To choosing yourself, said the other. Their voices wrapped around me like a soft blanket. After breakfast, they helped me tidy the kitchen, moving gently unhurried. When they left, the apartment grew quiet again, but the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt earned. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Snow fell in slow spirals, landing on the street below in delicate white patches. A year ago, snow had accompanied dread, each cold gust against my skin, reminding me that survival was not guaranteed. Now it reminded me of softness, of clean beginnings of breath. My father had been sentenced 3 months earlier. The judge's words still echoed faintly in my memory, not as trauma, but as confirmation that truth had weight. 2 to 4 years. Mandatory treatment programs. Permanent restrictions. No contact allowed. I no longer flinched thinking about him. I no longer checked the locks twice out of fear. I still checked them, but now out of habit, not terror. Healing did not erase the past. It simply reclaimed the reins. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat back down at the round table, folding my hands together. I thought of the younger version of myself standing in the hallway of my childhood home, pressed against the wall, counting breaths, hoping silence would keep me safe. I thought of the woman I became, the night everything shattered, the woman who walked silently into an ER, the woman who documented, survived, waited, then finally spoke. And I thought of the person I was now, whole, not because nothing hurt anymore, but because I had stitched every torn part of myself with truth. I opened my laptop and pulled up the storytelling channel where I had begun sharing glimpses of my journey, not with melodrama or vengeance, but with honesty. Vulnerability had become my form of rebellion, my way of transforming silence into something constructive. The camera light blinked softly as I began recording the closing message for my story, knowing it would reach people who needed the reminder that they were not alone. I spoke slowly. If you have ever lived through something you could not explain, something you survived quietly because speaking felt dangerous, then you already understand the weight of this story. If you have ever been told to stay quiet to keep the peace, I hope you know now that peace built on fear is not peace at all. It is survival disguised as obedience. You deserve safety. You deserve mornings where the light touches your face and you do not flinch. You deserve a life where your breath belongs to you. I paused, letting the stillness carry the meaning. And if you walked away even once, even halfway, even just in your heart, then you are stronger than you think. I closed the recording with an invitation. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is right now. Tell me the moment you realized you deserved better. Someone reading your words might need your courage to find their own. I ended the video and sat back in my chair, letting the hush of the apartment settle around me. The morning light stretched across the room, warm and steady. The life I had fought for felt real beneath my fingertips. When I lifted my mug to my lips, the coffee tasted richer than anything I remembered. Not because of the roast, not because of the cream, but because it belonged to a morning that finally belonged to me.